Hello, and welcome back to Fuller Exegetical. I'm continuing the series on Genesis 1 through 11 and examining young Earth creationist claims in light of what the early chapters of Genesis actually say. The first episode we covered Genesis 1 and 2, the two creation accounts, and how those might relate to the age of the earth or not. Last episode we covered Genesis 3 and 4, so the Garden of Eden, the fall of humanity, and Cain and Abel, and the many things that are tied up in those issues. This episode, we're covering Genesis 5 and 6, so the genealogy of Seth, and really just the first couple verses of chapter 6, which talk about the Nephilim and divine and human interbreeding. So the young Earth creationist claims I want to keep in mind are that the presence of these genealogies, both the one from Genesis 4 and the genealogy of Seth here in Genesis 5, lend itself to precise scientific historicity for Genesis as a whole. That the mere presence of a genealogy at all suggests that this is intended to be understood as history. After all, why bother tracing a lineage if you're not trying to do at some level history? And the other claim is really related. It's sort of part two of that claim, and that is that the ages of these individuals, which are sometimes extraordinary ages, near 1,000 years, can be added up, sort of working backwards to determine the age of the earth, going generation by generation, and getting a rough estimate for how much time has elapsed since creation. So that's kind of what I want to keep in mind as we examine these texts. So Genesis 5 is, as I said, a genealogy. It's the genealogy of Seth specifically. And by being Seth's genealogy, remember Seth is the third child of Adam and Eve, this is tracing the lineage of Israel through Noah back through Seth, through this righteous line of the third child. But even with that in mind, with seeing this as something that traces the lineage back through Seth, there's a striking similarity and really a parallel between Seth's lineage and that of Cain in Genesis chapter 4. And that can most clearly be seen through some of the similar names that appear at similar places in the genealogies, although they don't line up 100%. So the first would be, and I'm just going to read these, Enoch and Enosh, Irad and Jared, Mehujael and Mahalalel, Methushael and Methuselah, and then Lamech and Lamech. And Lamech, of course, is the same name in both genealogies, also occupying the same place in both genealogies. That being sort of the penultimate. So Lamech being Noah's ancestor, and Noah being the second to last generation, because it does name his three children. And that's a striking similarity, leading some scholars to suggest that really both these lineages borrow from a single lineage, a single set of generations, and are attributing them differently, one to Cain and one to Seth. But even with that in mind, it's clear that the compiler and the author here is intending us to understand these separately, that these are the descendants of Seth, and we are to trace the lineage back through Seth. And when we look, as I said, many of the ages here are really spectacular. 900, 800 plus years, Enoch being a bit of an exceptional case. And I might go into Enoch in another episode, but we see the ages as a general trend. The farther back we go, the longer lived the individual. The closer to the flood, the shorter lived the individual, and certainly after the flood we see much shorter lifespans. And that is actually mirrored by other cultures, many of whom actually also have flood narratives. And we see, especially in like the Sumerian kings list, the farther back you go pre-flood, the more you see these exceptionally long lifespans, much longer than what we see here in Scripture. There's one king actually who is said to have reigned for 65,000 years. That does throw a wrench in any idea that all ancient peoples understood the earth at this time to be very young. It seems some of them saw it as very much older. But that's an aside. The important thing to see is that this is a trend across multiple cultures of older kings, the farther back you go, sort of as a trend, having longer reigns. And then as you move closer to the present, more lifespans and reigns in line with what we would observe, less than 100 years. So why might this be the case, to see such exceptionally long lifespans in these historical figures? Well, one is that the length of a person's life, and for a king, the length of their reign, is connected in some ways to the greatness of that person, to their power, to their achievement in life. And so to set their age and their reign so long is to sort of make them larger than life, is to speak to the legendary character of these figures. The other function of these long lifespans and long reigns of kings is it sets these figures back in time, way far back, because each generation is so long that to go back just a couple of generations, you've gone back 1,000 years, 2,000 years. So it sets them way far back removed in time to this inaccessible, legendary, primordial time. And yet, at the same time, because they're included in a genealogy, that inaccessible primordial time is still tied to the national history and identity, in this case of Israel. It is separation, but still with connection. Now, my point in all this is not to say that all of this is fake, that it's pure fabrication or lies. Far from it. There's almost certainly truth to these genealogies in one level or another. My point is more to say that these can't be viewed as necessarily precise scientific history in the sense that we would think of it. Rather, they're meant to speak to the greatness of these people, to set them in time, and to paint a picture of the early primordial history of humanity as a whole, as well as Israel. So it's not that it's false, it's that it's answering questions that might be different than the ones we would tend to ask today. So that's all on 5. That brings us to Genesis 6, 1 through 4. This is the narrative of the Nephilim and of divine beings and humans interbreeding. This is a really ambiguous passage, and it comes across almost as like it's referencing a story that we as the reader are expected to already know well without retelling the full story. It's as if I were to make a reference to Darth Vader, expecting that the person I'm talking to has probably seen Star Wars. The unfortunate thing in this case is not only is the full story not included here, but it's just something we don't have. We don't have whatever full narrative is being referenced here, and so that leaves a lot up to interpretation, to guesswork, and to simply being unknown. One of the questions which is raised is, who are the Nephilim and why are they included here? Well, the identity of the Nephilim is very ambiguous. The word literally means the fallen ones, but without more context, that doesn't tell us much about who they are. There's a few options. Some would maybe say that they are some form of divine being, perhaps fallen angels, and that's the fallen reference. Another interpretation is to simply say that they're sort of legendary, perhaps mythological, mighty warriors of old. And there's some credence to this, which is lent to in Ezekiel 32, where it talks about the fallen warriors of old, these great warriors of old, who are now damned and entombed in the underworld. And so it's not the same word, but that word fallen is very similar to the word for fallen ones, Nephilim. And a lot of scholars do believe that Ezekiel is making a reference back here to Genesis. So it's certainly not an open and shut case. There's a lot of open questions on this. But on some level, viewing the Nephilim as like ancient legendary warriors seems to be kind of in line here. And as for why they're included, it seems to be, well, first of all, they don't seem to be the same or equated with the divine human offspring. This text doesn't state that specifically, and the reference to the Nephilim seems more of an aside or a parenthetical statement. It's almost saying, when the Nephilim were on Earth, that's the time period when what we're talking about happened. So they're providing a reference point for time, and perhaps also to set up this image in mind of legendary warriors of old, whether those are legendary for good or for evil, but legendary warriors of old as a framework to be thinking about these divine human offspring. The second set of figures we get in this passage of Genesis 6 are the sons of God. And like the Nephilim, that term is a little bit ambiguous here, but we do have a lot more evidence for it. So there's a few ways to interpret who the sons of God might be. The first, and probably most likely, is that the sons of God are meant to be understood as divine beings. And the reason I say that's most likely is that there's a few places in Scripture where this same phrase is used. In Job, this phrase, the sons of God, is used over and over again, and every time it's referring to heavenly beings. It's referring to the heavenly court. When God is talking to these other heavenly beings, it uses the term sons of God. The other place it's used a few times is in the Psalms, and again, often referring to probably angels or other heavenly beings, and so that seems most probable. But it's worth noting that some scholars do take this to possibly mean like pagan kings, and there's some logic to that. So oftentimes kings in the ancient world, and actually much more recently than this text, would have been thought of as divine or semi-divine. As recently as Rome, this was the case, with Caesar being declared a god or a son of a god. We see it in Egypt, we see it in a variety of cultures, and so that's kind of the logic behind maybe the sons of God referring to kings. Again, I think probably thinking of them, this is describing heavenly beings, divine beings of some kind is more likely, and I think it just fits with what this narrative is about a bit better. So with these sons of God, we see them, they see the human women, the daughters of men, and they find them to be beautiful, and they take them as much as they want. And this pattern of seeing, deciding what you see is beautiful and taking it, very much reflects what we saw with Eve in the garden. She saw the fruit. It was desirable, and she took it, to see and to take. It's also very similar to what we see a few other times in the Old Testament. So when Abram and Sarai are going through Egypt, and Pharaoh sees Sarai and sees her as beautiful, and he wants to take her. David sees Bathsheba from the roof. He sees her, he desires her, and he takes her into his palace and sleeps with her. This is the same kind of pattern over and over again. It's this image of lust, of perceiving the object of desire and needing to take hold of it and possess it. And here it fits in with further showing sort of a moral decay of humanity. We've seen murder, we've seen the bragging of Lamech, and now we're seeing this lust, but not just on the part of humanity. Now divine beings are being brought into the effects of sin and are partaking of sin. And it shows this sort of spreading of the effects of sin, not just to the physical world and humanity, but that its impacts are sort of rippling out wider and having an effect now among heavenly beings. When the divine beings do see and take the human women and then produce offspring with them, those offspring are talked about in the text, often is translated as heroes, great men of renown, or something like that. And I think that's worth unpacking, that when we say heroes, we're not necessarily meaning heroic in the sense of that they were morally good or upstanding. It's more talking about they were powerful, they were noteworthy, famous, but perhaps infamous as well. And it does carry this tinge of violence, that these were great warriors of old, maybe generals, maybe warlords. They were men seeking out to do great things, to make a name for themselves. And again, it fits with this picture of corruption and moral decline. That also fits with the comparison to the Nephilim. If the Nephilim are to be understood as legendary warriors of old who were damned to the underworld, then comparing these sons, or these offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men, kind of fits this tinge of violence and a condemnation of that violence. That also helps it to fit with what comes next, this slightly odd statement from God limiting human lifespan to 120 years. I think that serves a couple things. First of all, like we were talking about earlier, the pre-flood early human lifespans were very long, near 1,000 years in some cases, and yet the original readers of this, would have observed far, far shorter lifespans. And so this passage helps to explain that and to tie those two realities together. But it also displays an intervention from God in the face of these great legendary figures, that even such great legendary figures, even such divine human hybrids, are not beyond the intervention of God and are not beyond his justice or being brought to justice. God instills and puts in place limitations even upon them. So there's no immortals or no people beyond the law. Everyone is being brought to account. So in conclusion, Genesis 5 contains a genealogy, contains people who lived to incredible ages. And there's a lot to unpack from that. It speaks to a great primordial history. It highlights significant figures and the greatness of those figures. It traces the line through Noah back to Seth, of Israel, and ultimately of all humanity back through that same line. But it's not necessarily intended to be, and can't necessarily function as a complete or precise history. It's highlighting things, and it's speaking to the significance of these figures, but it's not the scientific sort of history that we might look for today, and so it can't answer the same kind of questions that we might ask in our modern historical inquiries. In this early section of Genesis 6, the Nephilim and the sons of God and the offspring of the sons of God are all mysterious and belong to this inaccessible primordial time. They're warriors and legendary figures of renown, but also bound up in the same effects of sin, bound up in violence and seeking after personal gain and power. They are emblematic of the effects of sin and the spread of the effects of sin, not only among humanity, but also now the heavenly realm is incorporated and brought into that same sin in the same struggle. But at the same time, we see God intervening and putting in limitations and bringing people to account for what has happened. It also sets up what we'll be talking about in the next episode of Noah and the flood and the state of the world and what led to things to get to that point. So with that in mind, I hope you enjoyed this, hope you learned something. If you think I missed something, let me know. Like I said, next time we will be talking about the flood narrative and everything going on with that. So I hope you join me for that again. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great week.